Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining our webinar, To Post or Not to Post, Regulations on Guns and Weapons in the Workplace. A quick note before we get started. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the chat feature on your screen. We will respond immediately to any technical concerns, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can about the material presented via follow-up emails after the presentation. And without further ado, here is Ashley Kaplan, our in-house senior employment law attorney. Ashley has been practicing labor and employment law for more than 20 years, representing employers in a variety of matters, from discrimination and harassment litigation to defending FLSA class action lawsuits. Here at Poster Guard, Ashley handles our legal compliance and also oversees the teams responsible for researching all the posting laws and developing compliance solutions to meet our customers' diverse needs. As a special offer to our attendees today, Ashley will be available to set up a complimentary personal consultation about your specific posting compliance needs. If you're interested, please indicate that in the question box and we will contact you to set it up. And now, here's our presenter, Ashley Kaplan.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Today we're going to cover some important information about labor law posting compliance and a growing trend we're seeing. And unfortunately, it's getting a lot more attention based on recent events, and that is the regulation of guns in the workplace. And today, we're going to be focusing on the state laws and the corresponding postings or signage that businesses need to display to communicate their policies on this topic. So just to clarify up front, when it comes to these postings, these are not considered mandatory postings for all employers, but they are required in a lot of states if you wish to prohibit employees or guests from bringing weapons onto your property. And as we're going to see, the laws are pretty strict on what you have to post and where. So we're going to go over all of that today. There are now more than 30 states that have enacted some type of legislation addressing guns in the workplace. And typically, these laws are designed to protect employees' individual rights to possess firearms. And they vary from state to state in terms of their restrictions, like I said, the postings, where the restrictions apply, which makes it really tough for employers operating in multiple states to comply, especially if you're trying to comply with one generic approach. It just won't work from state to state. And there is some research involved in getting it right. So today we're going to cover these specific requirements. I'll go over the state laws, all the different state laws, which states have some form of guns at work law and what that means for you as the employer, including your posting obligations. I'll also go over your options in the states that don't have any laws restricting guns at work. What this means in terms of your postings, signage, and also your policies. And at the end, I'm going to go over some general tips to help you implement your own weapons policy for your workplace, no matter what state you're in. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, recent tragedies around the country have focused a lot of attention on workplace violence in the United States. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in most recent numbers, of the 4,836 fatal workplace injuries that occurred in the United States in 2015, 417 of those were workplace homicides. And each year, nearly 2 million U.S. workers report that they are victims of workplace violence. And of course, there are untold numbers of employees choosing not to report incidents. This is just what's been reported. So given these issues and the danger to employees, it's easy to see why some employers want a complete ban on guns in the workplace. Some businesses do want that. However, this might not always be an option with these state laws that we're going to get to. So on a federal level, although there's no federal law that specifically regulates weapons at work, several states have enacted some type of guns at work legislation. And these state laws vary widely. That's what we're talking about. On the federal level, by the way, there is always the OSHA General Duty Clause. So there is a federal guideline on this. But the OSHA General Duty Clause really just requires you to provide a safe working environment for your employees. It doesn't really get that specific. There's nothing more specific on weapons in the workplace for private employers under OSHA or similar federal laws. So these state laws are all over the place, like I said. In some states, the law is pretty straightforward, and it allows you to totally prohibit weapons on your premises. You can ban employees from bringing any weapons on the premises anywhere on your property, including company parking lots. And then in a lot of these states, you can only prohibit weapons on your premises if you post certain notices informing employees that guns are prohibited. So a lot of the states allow you to completely ban employees from bringing weapons onto your property, but only if you post certain notices. Other states, you can ban weapons without using certain notices. And then there are other states, there's a whole bucket of other states that have what we call parking lot laws. And these parking lot laws allow, or they actually require you to allow your employees to have lawfully possessed guns in their vehicles in company parking lots, also company garages, and other areas that you provide outside your building for your employees. But in those states, most of those states, you still have the right to prohibit employees from carrying weapons inside your buildings. But again, even in these states, typically this can only be done if the proper notices are posted informing employees that guns are prohibited inside the building. So you have to be clear about what you're prohibiting and where. So that's why the postings and the signage are so important. So as of today, 31 states have enacted some type of legislation addressing guns at work, and out of those, 23 are considered parking lot states. All the states are listed here that have any kind of weapons at work laws. And again, some of these have specific requirements for the notices. Like in some cases, you have to use specific verbiage on your notice. Or it has to be a certain size with certain fonts and colors. It's all statutory. In some cases, you have to post in both English and Spanish. It all just depends on the state laws. And by the way, these laws change from time to time. They're always evolving. We've had a couple new ones just in the past year. So the posting requirements also change. But I'm going to go ahead and cover all the current posting laws, and I'm going to run through these 31 states that have regulations about guns in the workplace. For the other states that are not listed here, that means that typically you can just develop your own policy on weapons in the workplace. And it can be as strict or as open as you wish. Your postings, however, would just need to be consistent with those policies. So if the state allows it and your policy is to prohibit weapons anywhere on the premises, you can post general no weapons permitted signs around your property. You could do it in the parking lots, at your entrances to the buildings, and throughout the premises. And again, I'm just talking about the states that are not listed here. The ones that are listed here, which I'm about to go over, place certain restrictions on your policies and your postings. And just a reminder, at the end of the presentation today, I will go over some general tips to help you create a weapons policy, whether your state is listed here or not. So as we go through these state laws, keep in mind that I'm covering laws today that apply to most private employers. In some states, there are different laws for government establishments, like there can be different rules for schools, hospitals, and federal and state-owned buildings, and even for certain industries like child care facilities. So I'm going to be focusing on the private sector today. There are different laws altogether, even on a federal level for employees who work for the government. And so that's outside of the scope of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start with Alabama. Alabama is one of those parking lot states that I mentioned. So in Alabama, employers can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but you can't prohibit employees from storing a legally owned handgun in the employee's private motor vehicle in your parking lot, as long as these requirements are met. So the handgun has to be lawfully possessed. The vehicle has to be operated or parked in a location where it is permitted to be. the firearm has to be kept out of plain sight when the employee is in the car. And when the employee is not in the car, the gun, it has to be stored inside a locked compartment or container. That's straight from the law. The law does not allow employees to keep handguns in an employer-owned car. So everything I just went over is assuming it's not an employer-provided vehicle or company vehicle. So if it is a company car, you can prohibit the employee from storing a weapon inside it, even in the company parking lot. And for this, no special signs are required. So that means in Alabama, you can enforce these restrictions that I just went over with or without using a sign or a posting. So you can prohibit weapons inside your premises with or without a sign. However, if you do wish to prohibit weapons inside the premises, it is a good idea to communicate that with proper policies and also the proper signage, especially at your entrance. And again, you have to make sure that your signage doesn't overstep the law, because remember, employees are allowed to bring weapons into the parking lot in certain circumstances. So you can't just post a general sign, in your parking lot, for example, saying no weapons allowed. It can't be that broad. You can post what the rules are for keeping weapons in a vehicle, but you can't not say there's a complete ban on weapons anywhere on this property, because that would be interfering with the state law. For the inside of the premises, you can post a general no weapons allowed sign if you want to prohibit your employees from bringing weapons inside. There's no restriction on that. Okay, moving on to Alaska. Alaska is also a parking lot state. But each of these parking lot laws can be a little different. So if they are a little different, I am going to touch on that. In Alaska, employers cannot prohibit your employees from storing a lawfully owned handgun in a locked, privately owned vehicle in an employee-designated parking area, such as a parking lot or a garage. So that's straight from the statute. And just like Alabama, the law doesn't apply to company-owned cars or company-provided vehicles. Also, no sign is required, no special sign or posting is required for this to apply, but if you do use a sign in the parking lot or garage, it can't overstep the law. Again, it cannot be a complete ban on weapons in the parking lot. Now, for the inside of your building, in Alaska, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if you post signs at each entrance. That is required by law. The law doesn't give specific requirements for the signs, but you do have to post them if you want to enforce a no weapons policy inside your premises. So that means a generic no weapons allowed sign would be fine. That would be sufficient for Alaska. Arizona is also a parking lot state, but it's a little different than the other parking lot states. In Arizona, an employer has to allow employees to lawfully store any handgun that is both in the person's locked and privately owned motor vehicle or in a locked compartment in the person's privately owned motor vehicle and not visible from the outside of the motor vehicle. It cannot be visible. However, there's an exception to this parking lot rule. In Arizona, you can prohibit employees from storing handguns in their vehicles if, number one, your parking lot is secured by a fence or other barrier. Number two, access is limited by a guard or other security measures. And number three, you provide temporary and secure storage for the handguns. And the temporary storage has to be monitored and readily accessible upon entry into the premises. And it has to allow for the immediate retrieval of the firearm upon exit from the premises. So when the employee comes and goes, it has to be accessible. So if you have restricted parking areas that meet these requirements that I just went over, you can completely prohibit handguns in these restricted areas, even though it's considered a company parking lot. No signs or special postings are required in Arizona to enforce these policies, but again, it's a best practice to use a sign if you are prohibiting weapons, so you can communicate that policy to your employees. And then, of course, make sure it complies with the law, whether you fit into that restricted area exception or not. You need to be clear if you're, allowing guns in the parking lots because you have to, or if you fit under this limited access exception based on how your parking lot is set up with security. And then for the inside of the building in Arizona, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, and there are no specific posting or signage requirements. So if you do wish to prohibit weapons inside the building, a general no weapons sign at your entrances would be fine. Arkansas recently became a parking lot state in August 2017. So under the current law, an employer in Arkansas cannot prohibit an employee from storing a legally owned handgun in the employee's private motor vehicle in the employer's parking lot as long as the handgun is lawfully possessed, it's stored out of sight inside a locked private motor vehicle in the employer's parking lot, it is stored inside a locked personal handgun storage container that is designed for the safe storage of a handgun, and the employee has in his or her possession the key to the personal handgun storage container. For this one, there's also no specific signage or posting requirement to enforce this parking lot restriction. It is the law with or without a sign. Now, for the inside of the building, employers in Arkansas can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if you post a sign that specifically says, has to use these words, carrying a handgun is prohibited. And I included an image of a sample that would comply in Arkansas. Okay, let's move on to Colorado. So I'm not going to spend as much time on every one of these. I'm just going to highlight the main points for each of these states as we go. Also, I wanted to mention there's no need for you to write down all of these requirements as we go, especially if you operate in multiple states. It's just a lot of information to take in and to take down on paper. And we will be sending you this PowerPoint deck as a follow-up to the presentation. Also, Poster Guard, a lot of you are Poster Guard customers, so I wanted to mention Poster Guard offers a complete no weapons posting service. It's a 50-state service that provides the correct postings for each state. So again, no need to take down all these details and for each state's requirements and what the signs need to look like. The Poster Guard No Weapons service takes care of all the details, like making sure you have the right signage with the right size, font, colors, and specific wording that complies with each of these laws and each of these state statutes. So even if you're in a state that allows just for a generic no weapons allowed sign, that research is covered for you also as part of the service. So no matter what state you're in, you would get the right posting for if you wanted to prohibit weapons. The service also takes care of changes. So you get automatic notifications and automatic poster replacements whenever these posting laws change. And that's just like the regular Poster Guard service for federal, state, and local labor law poster changes. All of the mandatory labor law posters are sent automatically. So if you are already a Poster Guard customer, just keep in mind that what I'm going over today is an add-on service that you would need to specifically ask us for. And that is because it's not mandatory for everyone. These postings are only required if your business chooses to prohibit weapons on your premises. Otherwise, they're not required. So again, all of these posting requirements that we're talking about today, they only apply if you wish to prohibit weapons on your premises. If you do, these laws tell you what to post and where, and a lot of them get really specific. So if you do wish to prohibit weapons, you have to follow the posting requirements. But otherwise, these are not considered mandatory posters on their own. So I hope that makes sense. So just use the chat box or reach out to us by email if you do want more information on any of this, on the no weapons posting service, or if you have any questions on any of these state laws that I'm covering and how they might affect your posting obligations. So back to Colorado. Colorado is not a parking lot state, so there are no special protections for lawful gun carriers in your parking lots. So that means in Colorado, you have the right as an employer to limit, restrict, or prohibit handguns altogether in the workplace, including in your company parking lots. And in Colorado, no specific signage or postings are required to enforce your policy. You can just use a generic no weapons sign. That would be fine. D.C., the District of Columbia is not a parking lot state either. So just like Colorado, you can limit, restrict, or prohibit handguns altogether in the workplace, including in company parking lots. However, in D.C., there are specific posting requirements. So if you wish to prohibit handguns inside your premises, you have to post a sign at each entrance, and it has to specifically say, the carrying of firearms is prohibited on any private property. Also, the sign has to be at least 8 by 10 inches in size, and the writing on the sign has to be in at least 36-point type. That's all regulated by statute. And on this slide, I included a sample of a sign that would comply. So again, this is the posting required if you wish to prohibit handguns on your premises in D.C. Okay, moving on to Florida. Florida is a parking lot state. So in Florida, employers cannot prohibit an employee from storing a legally owned handgun in the employee's private motor vehicle in the employer's parking lot, as long as, and again, I'm taking this straight from the statutes, as long as the handgun is lawfully possessed, the vehicle is operated or parked in a location where it's permitted to be, and the firearm is locked inside the private motor vehicle. And by the way, the law says these restrictions do not apply to vehicles owned, leased, or rented by the employer. And that is the case with almost all of these laws. You'll notice they say employee-owned vehicle or private motor vehicle in almost every case. So if it's a vehicle provided by your company, leased or owned, any kind of company-provided vehicle, you don't have to allow employees to store their weapons in those vehicles, even in your parking lots, even in these parking lot states. So in Florida, no signs or posters are required for the parking lot prohibition, but if you do use a sign, make sure it does not overstep these rules. So, it doesn't overstep the law or violate the law. So just like with any of these parking lot states, you cannot have a complete ban on weapons in the parking lots. You can't have signs that say no weapons allowed if it's applying to the parking lot area. Now, for the inside of the building, Florida employers can implement a complete ban. You have that right. You can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, and that is with or without a sign. There are no specific postings you have to use. You can use a generic no weapons allowed sign. Georgia is also a parking lot state. So employers in Georgia can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but you cannot have a policy that prohibits employees from storing a licensed concealed firearm in the employee's vehicle on company property. And no specific signs are required here either. So you can have a generic no weapons sign at your entrance for the inside of your premises if you want to prohibit employees from bringing weapons inside. Idaho. This is not a parking lot state, and employers have the right to prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the workplace or anywhere on company property, including company parking lots. And also there are no special signs required. So in Idaho, you can just use a generic no weapons sign if you want to prohibit weapons anywhere on the premises, including in your parking lots. Next, we'll look at Illinois. So Illinois is a parking lot state, and it's a state with specific posting requirements for inside the building. So first of all, when it comes to the inside of your premises, from limiting access of employees with weapons to the inside of your premises, employers in Illinois may prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if you post a certain sign at each entrance. The sign has to include reference to the state statute. It has to specifically refer to 403 ILCS 6665. That's the state statute. And it has to have an image of a handgun in black ink surrounded by a red circle with a diagonal slash across the handgun. On this slide, I've included a sample of a sign that would meet the posting requirement. So it's very specific. For the parking lot, employers in Illinois must allow employees to store a handgun in the employee's private motor vehicle as long as the handgun is lawfully possessed, the vehicle is operated or parked in a location where it's permitted to be, and the firearm is locked in a case or container inside the private motor vehicle. And for this one, there are no specific signs that are required to enforce this when it comes to the parking lot. So as you can see as we go through these, a lot of these parking lot laws are pretty similar, but I am including the statutory language because sometimes, one or two words really does make a difference when you read the definitions and how it's spelled out. Okay, Indiana. Indiana is also a parking lot state, like Illinois. Employers in Indiana cannot adopt or enforce any rule or policy that prevents an employee from storing handguns in the locked trunk of the employee's vehicle, in the glove compartment of the employee's locked vehicle, or otherwise out of plain sight in the employee's locked vehicle. So that one's a little different. For the inside of the building, employers in Indiana can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, and there are no specific posters or signs required. So again, you can use a generic no weapons allowed or no weapons posting if you want to prohibit employees from bringing them inside. Next, we'll look at Kansas. Kansas is also a parking lot state, and the law is simply put. In Kansas, you cannot prohibit employees from possessing handguns in their private vehicles in company parking lots. That's how the law is stated. However, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, into the premises, but only if you follow very specific posting instructions. So to prohibit handguns inside your buildings, you have to post a sign at each entrance, and the law says that each of these signs has to adhere to these requirements. It has to have a white background. It has to include a graphic design that depicts the handgun in black ink, depicts the circle with a diagonal slash across the handgun in red ink, and it has to be at least 6 inches in diameter, that circle. The sign cannot contain any text or other markings within the 1-inch area surrounding the graphic design. The sign has to be visible from the exterior of the building and cannot be obstructed by doors, sliding doorways, displays, or other postings. The sign has to be posted at the eye level of an adult, which means that the entire sign is between 4 feet and 6 feet from the ground. That's how it's worded in the statute. The sign has to be posted not more than 12 inches to the right or left of each entrance to the building, and it has to be legible. The statute says each sign that becomes illegible must be replaced immediately. So if it fades out from the weather or whatever from wear and tear, it has to be replaced immediately. This slide shows a sample of a sign that complies with all these requirements. So again, this one is pretty specific. Okay, moving on to Kentucky, which is another parking lot state. And the law says employers in Kentucky cannot prohibit employees from storing legally concealed handguns in an employee-owned vehicle on company property. That one's pretty simple. But when it comes to inside the building, employers in Kentucky can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if signs are posted at each entrance. Now, this one's a little different because the law doesn't provide any specific requirements for the contents of your signs or your posters. So they can be as generic or specific as you want, but they do have to be posted at the entrance of each building if you want to prohibit employees from bringing in handguns. Louisiana. Employers in Louisiana can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, and it can be done with or without signage. There's no posting requirements. But for the parking lot, it's a parking lot state. Employees have the right to store lawfully possessed handguns in a locked, privately owned vehicle. However, the law does allow you to adopt a policy that handguns kept in employee cars must remain hidden from plain view or within a locked case or container within the vehicle. So you can put some restrictions on the parking lot rule. You also have the right in Louisiana to restrict weapons in the parking lot if you have a restricted access parking area. And that's a parking area where access is restricted through the use of a fence or a gate or some kind of security station or a security guard. Also, if you're using one of these restricted areas and you want to prohibit weapons in these restricted areas of the parking lot, you have to provide a facility for the temporary storage of the firearms So you have to provide a place for employees to temporarily store the unloaded firearms. Or you have to provide an alternate parking area reasonably close to the main parking area where employees can bring or store their firearms in locked, privately held vehicles. So this is similar to Arizona's exception for restricted access parking lots, but not exactly. It's just another exception where there's a certain kind of restricted access parking lot, and you're providing a way for employees to temporarily store their weapons. That becomes an exception to the parking lot rule. So in Louisiana, there are no specific signs required for these parking lot rules. But if you're going to use a sign, of course, it has to adhere to the law. You can't overstep. Moving on to Maine. Maine is also a parking lot state. So employers in Maine can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but you cannot prohibit employees from storing lawfully possessed handguns in a locked, privately owned vehicle on company property as long as the handgun is not visible from the outside. That's the only requirement. When it comes to postings or signage, there are no specific requirements behind these laws in Maine. You can enforce these laws with or without any specific signage. So you could prohibit employees from bringing guns into the building with just any kind of generic sign. In Michigan, and this is a shorter slide because in Michigan you can prohibit handguns anywhere in the workplace, including in your company parking lots. That is what the state law says. There are no specific signs that are required, so you could use a generic no weapons sign or poster for the parking lot and at the entrances of your buildings. It applies everywhere, so you can use a generic sign if you wish to keep employees from bringing weapons onto your property. Minnesota is a parking lot state, and it's a state with posting requirements if you want to prohibit employees from bringing weapons inside the property, inside your premises. So employers in Minnesota can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if you post a sign at each entrance. And the law says the signs have to be conspicuously posted at each entrance, and they must contain the following language: name of company, you fill in the blank, bans guns in these premises. Also, the lettering on the sign has to be at least 1.5 inches in height. That's another requirement in the statute. So this slide shows a sample of a sign that would comply. But when it comes to your parking lot, employees do have the right to store lawfully possessed handguns. It is a parking lot state. So again, you can't completely ban weapons anywhere on your property. But that would be the restriction in terms of the parking lot signage. You just can't overstep, again, with a complete ban. Okay, Mississippi is another parking lot state and also a state with posting requirements. So in Mississippi, if you want to prohibit employees from bringing their guns into the premises, you have to post a particular sign at each entrance. And the sign has to specifically state the carrying of a pistol or revolver is prohibited. Now, for the parking lot, you have to allow employees to store handguns in a locked vehicle owned by the employee on company property. However, Mississippi is another one of those states with an exception for restricted access areas where you can prohibit employees from having guns in your parking lot if you have a parking area that has restricted access through the use of a fence or a gate or a security station or a security guard. So if it's got limited access, either, imagine with a security guard or, employees have to use a code or a parking card to get access, then you can place additional restrictions on weapons in cars. But otherwise, you have to allow them if it's just a regular open access company parking lot that your employees use. Missouri is also a parking lot state where the law says employers cannot prohibit employees from storing handguns in a locked, employee-owned vehicle on company property. But that's for your parking lot. But when it comes to the inside of the premises, you can prohibit handguns, but only if you post a sign at each entrance informing employees that they are not permitted to bring handguns into the buildings. That's what the sign has to say. And it also, to be compliant, the sign has to be 11 by 14 inches at least, and the letters have to be at least 1 inch in height. So this slide has an image of a sign that would comply with those requirements. In Nebraska, employers can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but again, only if you post a sign at each entrance. And for Nebraska, the sign has to say, carrying a concealed handgun is prohibited in or on this place or premises. Nebraska is also a parking lot state. So in Nebraska, this means you cannot prohibit employees from storing handguns in a locked vehicle on company property. So you can require that the handgun has to be locked inside the glove box, trunk, or other compartment of the vehicle, but otherwise they are allowed in locked vehicles in your parking lot. And again, like all of these so far, the law does not apply to company-owned or company-provided vehicles. All right, now let's move on to New Mexico and North Carolina. I'm grouping these together on this slide because the laws are so similar. In these two states, employers can prohibit employees from carrying handguns anywhere on company property, and that includes in your parking lots. So these are not parking lot states. There's no parking lot exception. You can ban employees from bringing weapons anywhere on your property. To prohibit weapons on the premises, you do have to post conspicuous signs. However, in both of these states, the law says you do have to post signs to prohibit employees from bringing weapons inside, but the law doesn't say what those signs have to say. It's not that strict about the verbiage on the signs. So you can use generic signs that say no weapons or no weapons allowed, but you do have to post something if you want to prohibit weapons on the property. Okay, moving on to North Dakota. North Dakota is a parking lot state. So in North Dakota, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into your buildings, but when it comes to your parking lot, you cannot prohibit employees from possessing a legally owned firearm that is locked in a private vehicle not owned by the company. That's the wording of the statute in North Dakota. There's not a specific posting requirement for this, so you can enforce these rules for the parking lot or inside the premises with or without signage. And that means a general no weapons sign at the entrance of your building would probably be the best way to communicate your policy if you want to prohibit employees from bringing weapons inside, just to post that at the entrance. Okay, next is Ohio. Ohio recently became a parking lot state just this year. And when it comes to the inside of the building, in Ohio, you can prohibit employees from bringing weapons, and there is no posting requirement for that. So you have the right to prohibit employees from bringing weapons inside your premises with or without a particular sign. But for the parking lot, there's no specific posting requirement for the parking lot, but the law says you cannot have a policy or a rule that prohibits employees, if an employee has been issued a valid concealed handgun license, you can't prohibit that employee from storing the firearm when both of the following conditions are met. The firearm remains inside the person's privately owned motor vehicle while the person is physically present inside the motor vehicle, or the firearm is locked within the trunk, glove box, or other enclosed compartment or container within or on the person's privately owned motor vehicle. That's the first requirement. And the second requirement is that the vehicle must be in a location where it is otherwise permitted to be. And that's one we see pretty consistently. That just means it has to be properly parked in a designated employee parking area, that it's parked where it should be. Oklahoma is also a parking lot state. In Oklahoma, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, but only if you post signs around the property notifying employees of this policy. In Oklahoma, the law doesn't specify what the sign or the poster has to say or how it has to look. It just says you have to post a sign if you want to prohibit employees from bringing in handguns into your building. But because Oklahoma is a parking lot state, you cannot have a policy or rule that prohibits employees from storing their handguns in a locked vehicle on company property. In South Carolina, employers can prohibit employees from carrying handguns in the workplace, including in your company parking lots, but there are strict posting requirements if you want to prohibit weapons anywhere on the property. So whether it's inside or in the parking lots, if you want to prohibit employees from bringing weapons on the property, there are strict posting requirements. So the law says that the signs that you have to post must be posted at each entrance to each building where you're prohibiting employees from carrying a concealable weapon. The sign has to be clearly visible from outside the building, or multiple signs. They have to be clearly visible from outside the building. Each sign has to contain the words, "No concealable weapons allowed," in black, 1-inch tall uppercase type at the bottom of the sign. And that has to be centered between the lateral edges of the sign. Again, this one gets pretty specific. And also, the image on the sign has to contain a black silhouette of a handgun inside a circle 7 inches in diameter with a diagonal line that is 2 inches wide and runs from the lower left to the upper right at a 45-degree angle from the horizontal. And the sign has to be placed not less than 40 inches and not more than 60 inches from the bottom of the building's door. So that is a very specific one for South Carolina. Again, in South Carolina, you have the right to prohibit weapons inside the building and in your parking lots, but only if you post the proper signage that I just went over. And I've included an image on this slide of a sign that does comply. Moving on to Tennessee. Tennessee also has a posting requirement if you wish to prohibit handguns inside your premises. So to do so, you would have to post a sign at each entrance of the building. The sign has to say, "No firearms allowed," and it has to include the phrase, "as authorized by TCA Section 3917-1359. That's the Tennessee Code. That's the statutory reference. Also, the signs have to include the phrase, "No firearms allowed," as depicted by a circle with a diagonal line through the circle and an image of a firearm inside the circle under the diagonal line. It's kind of entertaining to read all these different statutes, how they try to direct the graphics or the graphic designer to do what's kind of a similar symbol on all of these. It would be nice maybe just to show a sample that everyone could adopt in every state. But like we've talked about, it's a little bit different in each state. So that's exactly how the law is written in terms of the graphics and how the sign has to look, and I've included an image of it on this slide, how the sign or poster should look to comply with all the Tennessee requirements. So that's for keeping weapons outside of your buildings. For the parking lot, Tennessee is a parking lot state, so in Tennessee, employers cannot prohibit employees from storing handguns in their vehicles if the firearm is lawfully possessed, the vehicle is permitted to park in the location, and the firearm is stored in the vehicle in a place hidden from ordinary observation when the person is in the vehicle, or locked in the vehicle's trunk, glove box, or interior, or in a container securely affixed to the vehicle if the individual is not in the vehicle. So this is one that gets into how it has to be stored and kept, for the scenario of the employee being in the car and also when the employee leaves the car to go to work for the day. Okay, and now for Texas. In Texas, you can prohibit employees from bringing weapons into your buildings at work, but there are required postings, and it's pretty strict if you wish to do so. So Texas actually amended its weapons laws in 2016. And because of that amendment, employers are required to post 2 different kinds of notices if they want to prohibit weapons, depending if it's open carry or concealed carry weapons. And the notices also have to be posted in English and Spanish. So these signs have to be posted at each building entrance, and they're a little different depending if it's concealed carry weapons or open carry weapons. But to prohibit concealed carry weapons on your property, you have to post a sign in a conspicuous manner, and it has to say specifically, pursuant to Section 30.06 Penal Code, trespass by license holder with a concealed handgun, a person licensed under Subchapter H, Chapter 411 Government Code, Handgun Licensing Law, may not enter this property with a concealed handgun. And like I said, this has to be in both English and Spanish. It has to be in contrasting colors with block letters at least 1 inch in height. And then if you wish to prohibit open carry weapons on your property, you have to display a second sign, a separate sign in a conspicuous manner. And it says pretty much the same thing. It just references openly carried handguns and the corresponding law Section 30.07. So it's very similar, but they are both required if you want to prohibit both types of weapons. Texas, that was concerning bringing weapons into the building. Texas is also a parking lot state. So the law specifically states that as an employer, you cannot prohibit employees who hold a license to carry a handgun or who otherwise lawfully possess a firearm from storing a firearm in a locked, privately owned motor vehicle in a company-provided parking area. That's all it says. And again, like all of these that we've gone over, these restrictions don't apply if it's your company vehicle or a company-provided vehicle. Okay, just a couple more left that we're going to go over. In Utah, you can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building with or without signage. There are no specific posting requirements to do that. But Utah is another parking lot state. So the law says you cannot have a policy that prohibits employees from storing a firearm in any parking lot on company property. You can require that the firearms are locked in the company in the vehicle, in the employee's vehicle, or locked in a container attached to the vehicle, and that they are not in plain view. So there are some restrictions you can place on the parking lot rule, but you can't prohibit the weapons altogether from the parking lot. West Virginia is pretty simple. The law allows employers to prohibit employees from carrying any guns into the workplace, and that includes anywhere on your property, including your company parking lots. And there are no specific signs required. So in West Virginia, you can use generic no weapons allowed signage to cover your buildings and also your parking lots if you want to ban weapons on your property. And then finally, there is Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, employers can prohibit employees from carrying handguns into the building, and there are no special posting requirements for this. And you can use generic signs. For the parking lot, you cannot have a policy that prohibits employees from storing a firearm in any parking lot on company property. You can have a policy requiring the firearms to be locked in the vehicle or locked in a container attached to the vehicle and not kept in plain view. But your policy has to allow for weapons to be stored if done in this manner in company parking lots. Those are really the only restrictions you can place on allowing employees to store their weapons in their vehicles in the parking lot. Okay, so that covers all of the states with their own legislation on guns in the workplace. But remember, in the other states, the ones that weren't listed that we didn't go over, you typically have the right to come up with your own employment policies on this. And either way, whatever the policies are that you come up with, whether you're allowed to come up with them on your own or whether the state tells you what the policies are, either way, it's important for you to put your policies in writing, to communicate these to your employees, even if it's just the law. And then it's also important to reinforce your policy with the proper signage to let employees know what the rules are. So even if the state doesn't require a certain sign in a certain place, if you have a no weapons ban, or you have a weapons ban, and you have a written policy, the best way to enforce that is to also have posters and signage up to let your employees know what the rule is and where it applies, especially if it's different for inside the buildings versus the parking lot. And obviously, your policy and posters or signage are all going to be governed by these laws that we just went over. So, especially if you're in one of the states with parking lot rules or posting requirements, you have to adhere to those. That's the first thing to look at. So whether you're in one of these states with regulations or in a state where you can make your own rules prohibiting employees from bringing weapons to work, there are some basics that you should consider whenever you're developing your policy. And again, I think every company should have a policy in place on this, no matter which way you want to go. So first, here are the basics with your policy. First, just to reiterate because it's so important, before implementing a ban on weapons, check your state and local laws carefully and draft your policy to match those laws. So if you wish to ban weapons, but you're in a parking lot state, your policy needs to acknowledge that weapons are allowed in the parking lot, and it needs to state exactly what those restrictions are as they are spelled out in the laws, like whether a weapon has to be locked or out of plain view, or whether you have one of those special restricted access parking areas that's guarded by security that makes you exempt from the parking lot rule. All of it depends on how your local and state law is worded, but you need to mirror that in your policy. And this is really, really important because most of these states with these laws, with these parking lot rules, make it illegal just for you to have a policy or a rule that oversteps the law. So a policy prohibiting weapons anywhere on company property would be illegal, just having that policy, whether you ever enforce it or not. So know your state and local law and make sure your policy matches it. Also, here are just some basic tips for drafting your policy. First of all, your policy should clearly state its purpose. What's the purpose of your policy? To prevent workplace violence and keep our employees safe, and also to respect and comply with state law and individuals' rights to possess firearms. Just for example, what is the purpose and the background of the policy? It should also define essential terms. As you saw in the different state statutes, some of them refer to weapons, sometimes it's firearms, sometimes handguns, sometimes open carry versus concealed. So be specific about what you're talking about. You also want to state that, you want to explain that despite state law provisions that might allow the carrying of concealed weapons, just in general by the public, that you, as the employer, you have elected to prohibit weapons on your property. Again, you want to explain that this is an employment policy that's addressing the conduct of employees when they come to work. Now, your policy should clarify, though, if it is expanding in scope and applying to the general public, which of course would depend on your state law, but it should clarify whether the policy applies only to employees or to all persons and guests entering the employer's premises. And like I said, that will depend on your state law, but you need to explain that. Is this just an employment policy, or is this a policy for all guests and everyone on our property? Next, you want to be clear about what physical areas of the business are covered, like whether you're including parking lots, if you're allowed to do so. You should also include clear procedures for employees to report threats or actual acts of violence. And then finally, set up a disciplinary process, and go ahead and spell that out in your policy. Set up a disciplinary process for employees that violate your policy, which should always include, in any kind of disciplinary policy, but especially when we're dealing with something this serious, you should always include a statement that, this may result in immediate termination. A violation of this policy may result in immediate termination upon management's discretion. So give yourself that leeway, as long as all the laws take swift and decisive action if someone is, bringing a gun inside when you have a clear policy prohibiting it. So once you have developed your policy, you want to make sure you distribute it to all your employees, and ideally you want to have your employees sign off, to acknowledge that they've received it. And for most of you, this would just be part of your regular handbook distribution or your handbook updating process if you regularly update your handbook if you have one. But if you don't, you could always do this policy separately. It could just be a standalone policy that you could distribute. Next, you want to make sure to post the proper notices to communicate and enforce your no weapons policy. And these are all the guidelines that we went over today. So, you want to make sure you have the right signs placed in the right parts of your facility, and that your signs and postings are consistent with your written policy, which again, in most cases, is driven by state law. And then finally, you want to assign a dedicated internal resource to monitor your state's gun laws. And I would especially recommend this if you have locations in more than one jurisdiction. If you're in multiple states, you want to make sure that you've assigned this to someone to, watch and monitor the laws to make sure, like I said, they do change from time to time, and you want to make sure that you stay in compliance for all your locations. And that'll help you also to, know when you need to update your policies, your handbook policies, your no weapons policy, your violence policies, and also your postings and signage. And then just again, when it comes to the postings, just keep in mind that Poster Guard does have a service that can handle all of this for you for all 50 states. And just let us know if you want more information on that after the presentation. Okay, well, that wraps it up. I hope you found this presentation to be helpful and informative. I know we went over a lot of legal requirements and details on all of these state laws, but there is a lot to share when it comes to these laws and what restrictions each state has on your ability as an employer to implement and enforce weapons policies in the workplace. If you have any questions or would like additional information about poster guard or any of the compliance issues that I've talked about today, please feel free to contact our compliance specialist, Peter Frey, at 954-970-5702, or you can reach Peter by email at pfray, P-F-R-A-Y, at hrdirect.com. Thanks again for attending today's presentation, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.